All right, well, I appreciate it. My name is Dr. Cefalu, and I'm a director of the Botanical Research Center here at Pennington. And this is actually our third year we're putting on this symposium to show you basically what we do here. And that's a very important question because our executive director asks what we do all the time. Okay. But what I'd like to do is basically give an introduction and then outline what we're going to do in this particular program. We have 3 talks tonight, basically to give you some ideas on what you should be doing with your diet, why you should be doing it with your diet. We're going to give you some exciting research data on particularly some research that we did with blueberries that we think is pretty exciting as far as prediabetes. So with that background, what I'd like to do is basically start with why we're studying and what this program's all about. And our interest is in primarily prediabetes. Now, how many of you have diabetes in your family? Okay, well, this is going to be pretty important to you because basically what I'm going to suggest to you is that diabetes doesn't begin. You don't wake up one morning with diabetes. That diabetes begins many, many years before, and actually we know we can prevent diabetes. Diabetes currently, as far as in the United States, it represents anywhere from 6 to 8% of the population. Louisiana represents one of the states with the highest mortality from diabetes, and diabetes is expected to double in the world by the year 2030. And we know right now that diabetes, half the cases of blindness in this country are caused by diabetes, half the cases of kidney failure, and 7 out of 10 people with diabetes are going to die of a heart attack. So it's a very important problem, and it's a problem we can prevent. So let me suggest to you that basically from going from this state of what we call prediabetes, and I'm going to define what prediabetes is. Prediabetes is basically a state where your body becomes inefficient. You can't feel it. But what happens is when you eat a meal, you release insulin. And insulin drives that sugar into the food, into your bloodstream. How efficient your body works defines whether you're pre-diabetic. So you develop this condition called insulin inefficiency, or your body becomes inefficient. It's like any work. It's like if you have an organization and they do a certain amount of work and you have certain workers and those workers get less efficient, well, eventually the work doesn't get done. And that's exactly what happens in diabetes. For example, let's say this represents how efficient your body is. Now, let's say your body becomes inefficient. Well, it actually calls upon your pancreas to start producing more insulin. So basically, the more your body becomes inefficient to this major hormone, the more your body has to produce this hormone. Now, you don't feel any different because basically at that particular point, that's called prediabetes. And prediabetes is basically you have normal blood sugars. Now, what separates a person who has prediabetes, and I'm going to show you tonight, prediabetes is primarily related to obesity. So the more obese you are, the more likely to become inefficient. Now, what separates a person who's pre-diabetic from becoming diabetic is very simple. Your pancreas fails. And when your pancreas fails, then the blood sugar begins to rise because now you're not doing the work in the body. And that's where you're diagnosed with diabetes. So this may occur 7, 10, 15 years before you're diagnosed. So we refer to this, once your blood sugar is a certain point, as diabetes. Now, how many of you know that anything above 100 for blood sugar is abnormal? That's called impaired glucose. That's the first step toward diabetes. But you know what? You don't develop diabetes until your blood sugar is 126. So you're well down the road by the time you diagnose diabetes. So we're interested primarily in this area here before the blood sugar becomes abnormal, and we're going to refer to that as prediabetes or metabolic syndrome. So prediabetes is basically your sugars are still normal, but through specialized tests we realize that your body's inefficient. Now I'm going to try to tell you later how you can define prediabetes. The important thing is from this particular study, this is a study that followed people for 20 years. And so throughout the 20 years there were people who developed diabetes, and then there were people who didn't develop diabetes. And they went back in the charts and they looked at their blood pressure and they looked at their cholesterol and looked at their weight, and they assigned them a risk. Now what we found out is simply this. Over the 20 years of the study, if you didn't have these risk of blood pressure and abnormal cholesterol and these other abnormalities, you didn't develop diabetes. But 15 years before the diagnosis, if you were non-diabetic, 15 years before the diagnosis, if we looked at your chart, you had a 2.4-fold greater risk. Less than 10 years before diabetes, 3.2-fold. If less than 10 years before, 3.6-fold, and if you were diabetic, 5-fold. So the bottom line is that the closer you get to developing diabetes, the greater the risk for a heart attack. So this tells us that things are happening in prediabetes that are not very favorable. Okay, so with this background, what is it about prediabetes? And this could be any cell in your body. Now, again, I don't know if many of you were awake. I wasn't awake in high school biology, so sometimes I forget what a cell looks like. But let's say this is a cell in the body, and this is how your body works. You have these little keys on the cell. So you eat a meal, and what does your body do? Your body releases insulin. And this insulin goes to this little key on your cells in your body, muscle and fat, and basically it sends a signal. And it sends a signal to these proteins inside the cell called sugar proteins. Now, so these proteins, as soon as you eat a meal, insulin flips on this switch, and these proteins then travel to the outside of the cell. And these are like little transporters. Then the blood sugar enters the body. Now, how efficiently it enters the body is what we call insulin sensitivity or insulin efficiency. So what happens in prediabetes, this whole system in the cell is not efficient. For example, if I go to the light switch, I don't know where the light switch is, but if I go to the light switch here and this room is dark, and I flip that switch, the lights are going to come on. That means that system between the switch and the light is very efficient. Now, if I go to that light switch and I flip the switch and the lights flicker or they delayed coming on, that tells me that that system between that switch and the light is inefficient. And that's what happens in prediabetes. Your chemistry in the cell is sluggish. Well, that's a problem, because if it's sluggish, then you have to create more insulin and produce more insulin, and that's the problem. All right, so this background, so what we're saying is basically after this little switch, your body becomes inefficient. Now, so that leads to prediabetes. So the major factor leading to prediabetes is obesity. Now, if you happen to be inactive, or if you happen to be older, well, then that leads to even more inefficiency. And I know that's hypothetical, because no one in Baton Rouge is sedentary and getting older. We know that. But this is the problem. This condition, insulin resistance or insulin inefficiency, leads to high cholesterol. It leads to elevated blood pressure. It leads to elevated sugar. It causes problems with your blood vessel, and it promotes heart disease. And this all occurs with your blood sugar at or near the normal level. So here's the problem we have. Basically, this is what the situation we have in this country. When we have exercise facilities with escalators going up, we can't burn another 5 or 10 calories there, can we? And also we need to recognize rapid eye movements does not count as exercise. And as I've said in the past, golfing, when you ride a cart with a six-pack, does not count as exercise. Okay, we do not count that as exercise. All right, so here's the problem. Now we recognize that how you are shaped matters. And now we classify individuals for years as whether you're an apple-shaped, more fat around the waist as opposed to the hips, or pear-shaped. Pear-shaped, particularly women, have a thin waist and increased fat around the hips and thighs. So you can actually measure your circumference of your waist to your hip, and if it's high, you're called apple-shaped. And otherwise, we call that pear-shaped. So this is important because it's the apple-shaped individual who ultimately develops or is at high risk of developing diabetes. So this was a study in which they actually looked at the waist measurement, how wide and large your waist circumference is. And they looked at those in the highest and the lowest percent. Interesting that, again, middle-aged individuals, when followed from age 54 to age 67, those with low waist circumferences had a low risk for diabetes. But look what happens in the individual who is apple-shaped. Now, these are people who are non-diabetic. This is developing diabetes. So you don't have to do these fancy measurements of waist to hip circumference. All you have to do is look at your belt size. This study suggested that men who had a belt size of 40 as opposed to 37, as opposed to women who had a belt size of 34 as opposed to 31, on those factors alone, studies have suggested you have a higher risk for heart disease and a higher risk for diabetes. So, what does this mean? Well, to define prediabetes, you can now go to the website, and there are profiles you can look at from the American Heart Association or for the World Health Organization. But simply put, you look at your waist circumference or your belt size, you measure your blood pressure, you look at your good cholesterol, you measure your glucose, you measure your triglycerides, and very simple things that you can put in these charts, in these calculations. And they're all available online. If you have any three of these risk factors, you have what is called metabolic syndrome. And studies have shown if you have metabolic syndrome and then you're followed over time, those who do not have metabolic syndrome, again, a low risk for heart disease, but those who have metabolic syndrome or prediabetes, a very high risk of metabolic syndrome. These are non-diabetics. This is based on waist, weight, glucose, blood pressure, triglycerides, and protective cholesterol. All right, so what's so magical about waist circumference? Well, here's a scan, and this is a CT scan, so you can imagine this is a person's backbone, and this is a person's umbilical cord, and here's that fat that we can all measure around. If we keep eating more of that Chex Mix, we'll all have a little bit more around the waist. But this is that subcutaneous fat. And then you have fat that's around your intestines, that buffers the intestines. It's called visceral fat. And that seems to be a culprit. Because when you look at type 2 diabetes, this really white mass here is fat. This is a non-diabetic. But when you look at a diabetic, you see really a lot of visceral fat. And this is what we think is one of the contributing factors to insulin inefficiency. It's a complicated system, but the bottom line is that fat is very active to secrete other hormones. Okay, so then we have this gentleman. So this could be any street in Baton Rouge, right? Again, within a half block, about 6 places to eat, all right? We have this gentleman who doesn't seem to be able to stop talking long enough to stop eating. Then we have, again, this is the problem we have. We have such a wide variety and types of food, and it's so convenient. And then we have this gentleman, clearly, when we talk about this gentleman who's going down this one-way street, again, we could just look at this gentleman, and we can see with his waist circumference that he is set up to have prediabetes. And unfortunately, these are the individuals that are really heading down the one-way street to diabetes. And this is really what this program, and this is really what we're trying to identify, not wait till you have diabetes, but to prevent diabetes. And some of the landmark studies that were done here at Pennington suggest that you lose your 5% of your body weight. You start exercising, and that's much better than any drug we have in preventing diabetes. So those studies have been done, and we can talk about those even more in the question and answer period. So talking about diabetes, here's where most of you have probably been diagnosed. That you've probably been diagnosed with an elevated sugar, and more likely than not, the doctor tells you to, well, you need to lose weight and exercise, but doesn't tell you how to lose weight and exercise. Then, if that fails, he puts you on a single pill. And if that fails, he may combine 2 pills. that fails over time, you may have to go to insulin. Now, in diabetes management today, there are other medicines that we can inject that are non-insulin that seem to work. But this is kind of late in the course, again, starting 5 years before diagnosis to 15 years after diagnosis. But this is where the increased heart disease begins in prediabetes. So what we want to do is basically employ nutritional strategies at a point where we can prevent the disease, and hopefully that's where we'll make some headway. So why are we here tonight? Well, number one, this is your tax dollars at work. We are a botanical center, which means we study the benefits of chemicals in foods. You know, you can eat fresh fruits and vegetables, and you've always heard an apple a day keeps the doctor away. We want to find out what's in that apple that keeps the doctor away. So there are chemicals in plants that are very beneficial. So there are 5 federally funded centers in this country. The one at Purdue basically studies age-related diseases. All of them focus on a particular disease. There's one at the University of Illinois Chicago, studies women's health. There's Wake Forest University, studies cholesterol and lipids. There's a center that studies cancer. And here at Pennington, we study prediabetes and metabolic syndrome. So what we do is basically we try to study the benefit of chemicals in plants, and we study them in the lab. And if they work, well, we'll take them to the animals. And then if they work, well, that benefits you because now we know why these compounds in plants work. We've actually had some pretty good success, and this is all on our website. But to get the kite plant, we just don't go out and find a plant and study it. You have to carefully grow the plant. Because if you alter the sunlight, you alter the water, you alter the chemicals in the dirt, you're going to alter the chemicals in the plant. So our plants we collaborate with the University of Rutgers, which grows them hydroponically, grows them in greenhouses. And we've shown that there's a component in tarragon, a plant, the spice, that may be helpful in diabetes. But you're probably aware of all the supplements on the market, right? You go to any drugstore, any nutritional store, and you're going to see all these supplements. And the question is, do they work? So we studied many of these supplements, and there was one supplement out there that promoted weight loss, and it was in like 15 to 20 commercial products. Well, we proved here that it doesn't work at all. So that's important to know. Not only if we find something that does work, but if we find something that doesn't work, then you need to know that also. And again, a lot of this information is on our website. Well, what we're going to talk about tonight is eating and drinking the rainbow, because what you're going to find out, there are a lot of benefits to pigmented fruits and vegetables. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So what we'll do is we have 3 presenters, and I'll introduce the first presenter, and then we'll take a couple of questions and answers after that, and then we'll have a panel discussion at the end. So our first presenter is Dr. Haley Roy. She's an associate professor at the LSU Ag Center, and she's going to give us an update on how to eat the rainbow, right?